Some people spend their whole lives running from the past, only to find it waiting beside their own fence line at sundown. The crying started just as the last light slipped behind the Arizona hills. Cole Mercer paused halfway through closing the barn doors, his rough hands still gripping the lantern handle while the evening wind pushed dust across the ranch yard in slow waves. At first, he thought it was the sound of some wounded animal caught near the creek. Out here, lonely sounds carried strangely after dark. But then he heard it again. Soft. Human. A woman crying somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees near the north fence. Cole set the lantern down beside a rain barrel and rested one hand near the revolver hanging low on his hip. Folks did not wander this far from town by accident, especially not after sunset. The air smelled of dry dirt and distant rain as he walked toward the sound, boots crunching against gravel, every step measured and quiet. The crying stopped the moment he reached the fence line. There, beneath the old cottonwood tree, sat a woman wrapped in a faded Apache blanket darkened by dust and travel. Her long black hair hung wet against her shoulders, and both hands trembled around a small silver object pressed tightly against her chest. She looked exhausted, like someone who had spent too many nights sleeping under open sky with fear as her only companion. Cole noticed the blood on her fingers before he noticed anything else. Not fresh blood, dried blood. The woman slowly lifted her eyes toward him, and something inside Cole tightened without warning. Her face carried the hard beauty of desert stone, proud even in sorrow, but it was her expression that unsettled him. She looked at him the way people look at ghosts. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Wind whispered through the cottonwood branches overhead, while thunder rolled somewhere far across the plains. Then the woman finally opened her hand. A silver harmonica rested against her palm, scratched with age, one corner bent inward from damage long ago. Cole's breath caught so suddenly it almost hurt. He knew that harmonica, every dent, every scratch. His father had given it to him when he was 8 years old. He had lost it during the worst winter of his life. That belongs to me, Cole said quietly, though the words sounded uncertain even to himself. The woman lowered her gaze to the harmonica for a moment before speaking in careful English touched by a soft Apache accent. No, she whispered. It belonged to a frightened little boy who could not stop crying in the snow. Cold rushed through Cole's chest despite the desert heat. Somewhere deep inside him, buried beneath 20 years of dust and silence, a memory stirred. Snow falling hard beneath moonlight. Wolves howling in the dark. Small hands dragging him through freezing wind while he struggled to stay awake. Cole took one slow step closer. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman looked at him again, and tears filled her eyes so suddenly it seemed they had been waiting there all along. "You truly do not remember me," she said softly. Then she glanced toward the distant hills beyond the ranch, where faint dust clouds had begun rising against the fading sky. Her voice dropped lower. "But they remember me." Cole turned sharply toward the horizon. Riders were coming. The riders moved fast enough to push a wall of dust ahead of them, for dark shapes cutting across the fading evening light while thunder rolled low behind the mountains. Cole Mercer narrowed his eyes and instinctively stepped in front of the woman beneath the cottonwood tree. He did not know why he did it. Maybe it was the fear in her face. Maybe it was the harmonica still resting in her trembling hands. Or maybe some forgotten piece of the frightened little boy she mentioned had suddenly awakened inside him after 20 years of silence. The woman rose slowly to her feet, though pain flashed across her expression the moment she put weight on her left leg. Cole noticed then that her moccasin was torn near the ankle, stained dark with dried dust from miles of walking. She had not stumbled onto his ranch by accident. She had been running. "You should leave," she whispered without looking at him. "If they see me here, they will bring trouble to your door." Cole kept watching the riders approach. "Looks like trouble already found the place." The woman closed her fingers around the harmonica so tightly her knuckles turned pale beneath her skin. "You still joke the same way." That made Cole glance at her sharply. "I was 8 years old," he said quietly. "I barely remember that winter." A sad smile touched her lips for less than a second. "I remember enough for both of us." Wind swept across the ranch yard, carrying the smell of rain and horse sweat as the riders finally reached the fence line. Their horses snorted heavily beneath them, restless from the hard ride. The oldest rider sat tall in the saddle with a weathered gray coat, hanging from broad shoulders. His eyes moved from Cole to the Apache woman, then stopped on the silver harmonica in her hand. Something changed in his face immediately. Not anger. Recognition. "Well," the rider said slowly, "I did not expect to find her here." The woman lowered her gaze toward the dirt, but Cole noticed her breathing quicken. The other three riders looked younger, rougher, the kind of men who spent too much time in saloons pretending whiskey could wash guilt from their hands. One of them spat into the dust near the fence. "You know what she did down in Red Hollow?" he asked Cole. "Merchant ended up dead. Sheriff wants her brought in before sunrise." Cole said nothing. He had heard enough stories in the territory to know the truth usually arrived long after blame did. The older rider finally climbed down from his horse, boots landing softly against the dirt. Up close, he looked tired, older than the plains themselves. "Name is Walter Grady," he said. "We are not here looking for trouble, Mr. Mercer. We only want the woman." Cole folded his arms across his chest. "Funny thing about that. She looks more hunted than dangerous." One of the younger riders laughed under his breath. "That is how they fool you." The Apache woman suddenly stepped forward before the tension could grow sharper. "Enough," she said quietly. "I will go." Cole turned toward her immediately. "You walked all the way here carrying that harmonica just to surrender?" Her eyes met his then, dark and heavy with exhaustion. "I came because my son is missing." Silence settled over the ranch yard. Even the horses seemed to stop moving. The woman swallowed hard before continuing. "The merchant they speak of," she said softly. "He took Apache children from the camps near Red Hollow. My boy disappeared 3 nights ago." The younger rider scoffed. "Convenient story." But Walter Grady did not laugh. His eyes stayed fixed on the harmonica in her hands. Then, very quietly, he asked one question that made the evening air suddenly feel colder. "Did she tell you who saved your life during the winter of '78, Cole?" The question hung over the ranch yard heavier than the coming storm. Walter Grady stood beside his horse with rain beginning to darken the shoulders of his coat, while Cole Mercer stared at him in silence. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder rolled again across the Arizona plains, low and distant, like the land itself remembering something old. Cole slowly looked toward the Apache woman. She had not moved. Her fingers still wrapped around the silver harmonica, as though letting go of it might pull apart the last 20 years of her life. "You knew me," Cole said finally, his voice quieter now. "Back then." The woman nodded once. "Your father traded near our winter camps." Her eyes drifted toward the cottonwood branches swaying overhead. "One night, the snow came early. You wandered too far from the wagons." Fragments returned to Cole in broken flashes. White snow beneath black sky. Frozen hands. The sound of wolves somewhere in the dark hills. He remembered crying until his throat burned. Then warmth. A fire. Someone humming softly while he drifted in and out of sleep. "I thought I dreamed that," he whispered. The woman looked at him with an expression too tired to be anger and too sad to be forgiveness. Dreams do not leave scars. Cole swallowed hard. He realized then that he had never even asked her name. "What do they call you?" he asked. "Ayanna." The younger rider nearest the fence scoffed loudly. "Does not matter what they call her. Sheriff only cares where she hangs her guilt." Walter Grady shot the man a sharp look that silenced him immediately. Then the older man turned back toward Cole. "The merchant from Red Hollow. Disappeared 2 nights ago," Walter said carefully. "People claim they saw Ayanna near his property before dawn." Ayanna's face hardened at once. "Because I was searching for my son." One of the younger riders crossed his arms. "Or searching for revenge." Cole noticed the way Ayanna flinched at that word. Not with fear. With exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person after carrying grief too long. Rain finally began falling steady now, soft drops tapping against the ranch fence and soaking into the dirt. Ayanna looked toward the mountains far beyond the open plains. "My boy is 9 years old," she said quietly. "His name is Dakota. 3 nights ago, men came near our camp after dark. The children woke screaming." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes drifted somewhere far away. "By morning, my son was gone." Cole felt something twist inside his chest. 9 years old. Almost the same age he had been during that winter storm. Walter Grady removed his hat slowly, rain dripping from the brim. "There have been whispers for months," he admitted. "Children disappearing near mining camps. Mostly Apache, sometimes Navajo." One of the riders shifted uncomfortably in the saddle. "That is just rumor." Walter ignored him. The merchant in Red Hollow dealt with labor crews for the silver mines. Cole's jaw tightened. You think he was taking children? Walter looked toward Ayana before answering. I think somebody was. Silence settled again. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly across the barn roof behind them. Then Ayana suddenly stepped closer to Cole, her dark eyes locking onto his with a desperation she could no longer hide. I did not come here because I trust white men, she whispered. I came because once, long ago, a frightened little boy promised he would never forget the girl who saved him. Cole felt his throat tighten painfully. Ayana. But before he could finish, one of the younger riders suddenly pointed toward the distant hills. Look! Everyone turned at once. Far across the plains, another line of riders appeared through the rain. More than 10 this time. Moving fast. And even from a mile away, Cole could already see the sheriff's badge catching. Flashes of lightning beneath the dark sky. The storm reached the ranch before the sheriff did. Wind swept hard across the plains, bending the tall grass flat, while rain hammered against the barn roof in restless waves. Cole Mercer stood near the fence with one hand resting low beside his revolver, though he had no desire to use it. Across the yard, Ayana remained perfectly still beneath the cottonwood tree, her dark hair blowing across her face while the silver harmonica trembled slightly in her hand. The approaching riders grew clearer with every passing second. Sheriff Elias Barrett rode at the front beneath a black oilskin coat, his silver badge flashing each time lightning cracked behind the clouds. 10 men followed him through the mud, their horses snorting steam into the cold evening air. Nobody spoke at first. The sheriff slowed his horse near the gate and studied the scene carefully. Walter Grady standing beside his saddle, Cole near the fence, and the Apache woman at the center of it all like a shadow dragged from the past. Long ride for weather like this, Cole finally said. Sheriff Barrett removed his gloves slowly, eyes never leaving Ayana. Depends what is waiting at the end of the ride. One of the deputies pointed toward her immediately. That is her. Ayana lowered her gaze toward the soaked dirt beneath her moccasins. Cole noticed the exhaustion in her posture now more than the fear. She looked like someone who had already spent her last strength simply reaching this place. Sheriff Barrett climbed down from his horse carefully. Unlike the younger men, he did not move with anger. He moved like a man carrying something heavier than authority. Ayana, he said quietly, you should have left the territory before this turned worse. Her eyes lifted sharply toward him. Worse for who? The sheriff exhaled slowly. Rainwater slid down the brim of his hat, while thunder echoed across the hills again. The merchant from Red Hollow had powerful friends, and my son had only me. Silence followed her words. Even some of the deputies shifted uncomfortably at that. Cole looked toward Barrett. You know her? The sheriff hesitated for a long moment before answering. I know her father. Ayana's expression hardened instantly. My father is dead. Barrett nodded once. I heard. Wind rattled the fence line between them. Cole suddenly realized this was not the first time these two had stood across from each other carrying the weight of unfinished history. One of the younger deputies rode forward impatiently. Sheriff, we wasting daylight for an Apache woman now. Barrett shot him a cold look sharp enough to stop the man mid-sentence. You will hold your tongue on this ranch. The deputy leaned back in the saddle, but muttered something under his breath anyway. Cole ignored him. His attention stayed fixed on Ayana. Tell him, Cole said quietly. Tell him what happened to your boy. Ayana closed her eyes briefly as rain soaked through the faded blanket around her shoulders. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded smaller somehow, stripped raw by grief and exhaustion. 3 nights ago, men came near our camp after dark. They carried mining lanterns and spoke English. Her fingers tightened around the harmonica. My son ran when the horses spooked. I chased after him, but by sunrise all I found were wagon tracks leading toward Red Hollow. Barrett looked away toward the mountains for a moment, jaw tightening beneath the rain. There are old tunnels near the abandoned silver mines, he admitted quietly. Some crews still use them for illegal digging. Cole stared at him. And children. Barrett did not answer fast enough. That silence told Cole more than words could. Ayana stepped closer then, rain dripping from her chin while her eyes burned with desperate resolve. I do not care who wants me arrested, she whispered. I only care whether my son is still breathing beneath that mountain. Lightning split the sky overhead, bright enough to turn every face pale for one sharp second. And in that flash of white light, Cole saw something he could not ignore anymore. Sheriff Barrett looked ashamed. Shame looks different on a man who has carried a badge too long. Cole Mercer saw it plainly in Sheriff Elias Barrett's eyes as the rain poured harder across the ranch yard. The old lawman stood motionless beside his horse while thunder rolled through the valley behind him, and for a moment he no longer looked like the most respected sheriff in 3 counties. He looked tired in the kind of way sleep could never fix. One of the deputies finally broke the silence. "Sheriff, we cannot stand here all night listening to stories." Barrett slowly turned toward him. "You ever lose a child, Daniel?" The young deputy immediately looked away. Barrett nodded once as though that answered enough. Then he faced Cole again. 3 months ago, miners found silver veins reopening near Red Hollow. Illegal crews moved in before the territory office even knew about it. Rainwater dripped from the sheriff's gray beard while his voice stayed low and steady. Men started making easy money. Easy money attracts ugly things. Ayanna stood near the cottonwood tree without speaking. Her soaked blanket clung to her shoulders while the silver harmonica rested against her chest like something sacred. Cole noticed her eyes never stopped searching the faces around her, as if hoping somebody would finally tell her where her son had gone. "You knew children were disappearing," Cole said quietly. Barrett lowered his gaze. "I heard rumors." "And you ignored them?" The sheriff flinched slightly at the accusation. No, his answer came fast this time. "I started asking questions." One of the riders behind him shifted uneasily in the saddle. Walter Grady watched the sheriff carefully, but said nothing. Barrett removed a folded piece of paper from inside his coat and handed it toward Cole. The edges were soaked from rain, but the handwriting remained clear enough to read. Names, dates, mining routes, supply deliveries near abandoned tunnels outside Red Hollow. Cole looked up sharply. "You were investigating them." Barrett nodded once. Quietly. Why quietly? A bitter smile crossed the old sheriff's face. "Because half the men financing those mines sit inside the town church every Sunday pretending to fear God." Wind swept hard across the ranch again, rattling the fence posts. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted nervously. Cole studied the paper in his hands while pieces slowly began fitting together inside. His mind. Missing children. Secret mining tunnels. A dead merchant. Men with money trying to bury the truth before anyone uncovered it. Ayanna suddenly stepped closer through the rain. "Then help me find my son." Her voice cracked for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Please." Barrett looked at her for a long moment before answering. "If the boy was taken to the tunnels, there is still time." One of the younger deputies immediately objected. "Sheriff, we cannot go chasing ghost stories in the middle of a storm." Barrett's eyes hardened instantly. That woman carried a white boy through a blizzard 20 years ago, while most men would have left him to freeze. Silence crushed the yard again. Cole looked toward Ayanna slowly. She never raised her eyes from the muddy ground. Barrett continued quietly. "I remember that winter. Your father searched those hills for 3 days, Cole. Everyone thought you were dead." Cole swallowed hard. He had heard the story all his life, but never the whole truth. Never this part. "Why did nobody tell me?" he asked softly. Barrett stared out toward the storm-dark mountains. "Because after she saved you, some men in town decided an Apache family living near the trade routes made them nervous." Ayanna's breathing grew shallow. Walter Grady closed his eyes briefly like a man hearing an old sin spoken aloud at last. "Your people burned our winter camp before spring came," Ayanna whispered. "My father died that year." Cole felt the rain turn cold against his skin. The harmonica suddenly seemed heavier than iron in her hands. Then Ayanna lifted her eyes toward him again, full of sorrow too deep for tears now. "I did not come here for revenge, Cole Mercer," she said softly. "I came because your town took the only thing I had left." The hardest thing for a man to carry is not guilt. It is the moment he realizes the people who raised him built their comfort on someone else's grief. Rain poured steadily across Cole Mercer's ranch, while nobody spoke for several long seconds. The sheriff stood near the gate with water dripping from the brim of his hat. Walter Grady remained beside his horse, staring into the dark plains beyond the fence line. Even the younger deputies had gone quiet now, their earlier confidence washed thin beneath the storm. Ayanna stood alone beneath the cottonwood tree, soaked to the bone, holding the silver harmonica against her chest like the last surviving piece of a broken world. Cole looked at her differently now. Not as a stranger. Not even as the frightened Apache girl from the snowstorm. He looked at her like a man finally seeing the truth that had been buried beneath his own life for 20 years. "Why did you keep this?" he asked softly, nodding toward the harmonica. Ayana lowered her eyes to the silver instrument resting in her hands. "Because it reminded me there was once a boy who did not hate us." Her answer settled heavily in the cold evening air. Cole looked away toward the barn for a moment, jaw tightening. He remembered his father teaching him how to mend fences, break horses, survive droughts. But suddenly he wondered what else his father had known. What else the town had hidden beneath all those years of silence. Sheriff Barrett finally spoke again. If the mining crews moved the children into the old tunnels, they would use the Northern Ridge Trail. Walter Grady nodded immediately. Shortest path from Red Hollow. One of the deputies frowned. "Those tunnels collapsed years ago." "Most did," Barrett answered quietly. "Not all." Ayana stepped forward through the ring. "Then we waste time standing here." Her voice carried no anger now, only desperation. Cole noticed the exhaustion in the way she moved. She had walked for miles carrying fear, memory, and grief all at once. Yet somehow she was still standing. He admired that more than he wanted to admit. One of the younger riders suddenly shook his head. "Sheriff, this is madness. We are chasing rumors because of one Apache woman." Before Barrett could answer, Cole spoke first. No, everybody looked toward him. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, while his eyes remained fixed on the deputy. "We are chasing a missing child." Silence followed immediately. The deputy shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, but said nothing more. Ayana looked at Cole then, truly looked at him for the first time since. Arriving at the ranch, something softened in her expression, though sadness still lived deep inside her eyes. Cole stepped toward the barn and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Warm lantern light spilled across the muddy yard while the smell of leather and hay drifted into the ring. He reached for an old rifle hanging near the saddle rack, then paused. Slowly, he set it back down. Instead, he grabbed a lantern, extra blankets, and a coil of rope. Sheriff Barrett noticed immediately. "You expecting trouble?" Cole shook his head once. "I am expecting children trapped underground." Walter Grady gave a quiet nod of approval. The older man climbed back into his saddle and tightened the reins. "Storm will hide our tracks if we leave now." Ayana suddenly swayed slightly where she stood. Just for a second, exhaustion catching up to her at last. Cole crossed the yard without thinking and offered her his coat. She hesitated. "You will freeze." "I grew up in these hills," he said quietly. "You saved me once. Let me return the favor before the world ends." For the first time that night, the corner of Ayana's mouth lifted into the faintest trace of a smile. Small, tired, almost broken, but real. Then lightning flashed again across the mountains in the distance, illuminating the dark outline of the Northern Ridge Trail. And somewhere far beyond those hills, beneath stone and silver and buried secrets, a frightened little boy was still waiting for somebody to find him. The mountains looked different at night. During daylight, the Northern Ridge appeared dry and harmless, just another stretch of Arizona stone beneath endless sky. But under storm clouds and lightning, the old mining trails twisted through the darkness like scars the land had never healed from. Cole Mercer rode at the front beside Sheriff Barrett while rain soaked through his shirt and cold wind swept dust against the horse's legs. Behind them came Walter Grady and two deputies carrying lanterns that flickered weakly against the storm. Ayana rode silently near the back on Cole's spare horse, wrapped in his heavy coat with the silver harmonica tucked safely beneath the fabric near her heart. Nobody spoke much. During the climb, hooves scraped carefully across loose rock while thunder echoed between the canyon walls in long hollow waves. The farther they rode from town, the quieter the deputies became. Even they could feel it now. Something ugly waited beneath these mountains. Cole glanced back once and caught Ayana staring toward the ridge ahead with an expression that tightened his chest. Fear. Not for herself. For her son. Sheriff Barrett finally pointed toward a narrow trail cutting between two cliffs. "Old Supply Road," he said over the wind. "Leads straight to the abandoned shafts." Walter Grady frowned. "Thought the entrance collapsed years ago." Barrett nodded once. "Officially, yes." They rode another half-mile before the horses suddenly became restless. Cole noticed it first. Ears twitching, nervous breathing. One horse refusing to step forward. Then he heard it too. Faint voices somewhere ahead beneath the storm. Children. The group stopped immediately. Rain dripped from hat brims while everyone listened carefully. Ayana slid from her saddle before anyone could stop her. "Dakota!" she shouted into the darkness. The canyon swallowed her voice and threw it back, broken by thunder. Then, from somewhere deep beyond the rocks, came a weak answer. "Mother!" Ayana nearly collapsed with relief. Cole caught her arm before she stumbled against the stones. Her eyes filled instantly with tears she no longer tried to hide. "He is alive," she whispered. Sheriff Barrett motioned for the lanterns to be lowered. "Quiet now." They moved carefully through the narrow canyon passage until the abandoned mine entrance finally appeared beneath a jagged overhang of stone. Old wooden beams leaned crooked against the opening, weathered gray by years of wind and neglect. Faint lantern light flickered from somewhere inside. Cole smelled smoke. Wet dirt. Fear. Ayana stepped closer to the entrance, but Barrett gently stopped her with one hand. "Wait." She looked ready to push past him anyway. "That is my son in there." Barrett's expression hardened beneath the rain. "And if frightened men are guarding those tunnels, rushing inside helps nobody." Cole crouched near the mud outside the entrance and studied the tracks. Wagon wheels. Heavy boots. Small footprints scattered everywhere. Children's footprints. His stomach turned cold. Walter Grady removed his hat slowly. "Dear God." One of the deputies whispered under his breath. "How many kids they hiding down there?" Nobody answered. Then another sound drifted out from inside the mine. Crying. Soft. Exhausted. More than one child this time. Ayana covered her mouth with shaking fingers while tears streamed silently down her face. Cole felt something inside him snap loose at that moment. Not anger. Something heavier. Shame. Because suddenly the stories about missing Apache children were no longer rumors whispered in saloons. They were real. Breathing. Terrified. Hidden beneath American soil, while decent men pretended not to notice. Sheriff Barrett slowly drew a breath. "No shooting," he said firmly. "Those children have already seen enough fear." Cole nodded once. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat while he tightened his grip on the lantern. Then, from deep inside the tunnel, a frightened child's voice echoed weakly through the darkness again. "Please, somebody help us." Sometimes evil survives because good men convince themselves somebody else will stop it. The abandoned mine smelled of wet stone, smoke, and years of buried secrets as Cole Mercer stepped carefully through the narrow entrance holding the lantern high. Shadows crawled across the tunnel walls while rainwater dripped steadily from the ceiling like the mountain itself was grieving. Sheriff Barrett moved beside him with one hand resting near his holster, though he had already made it clear this night would end without bloodshed if he could help it. Behind them, Walter Grady guided the deputies forward while Ayana followed close enough to hear every frightened sound echoing through the darkness ahead. The crying grew louder deeper inside the mine. Small voices. Exhausted voices. Children trying not to sound afraid. Cole felt his stomach tighten harder with every step. 20 years ago, this same territory had nearly buried one Apache child in snow and silence. Now it was burying dozens beneath stone. They rounded a narrow bend in the tunnel and finally saw them. Children huddled together beneath old mining blankets near a weak lantern hanging from a support beam. Apache children. Navajo children. Even two white boys no older than 10 with dirt smeared across their faces and fear hollowing their eyes. The moment the children saw the sheriff's badge, several of them shrank backward against the wall. That hurt Barrett more than any accusation could have. Ayana suddenly dropped to her knees. Dakota. A small boy near the back looked up instantly. His dark eyes widened with disbelief before he stumbled forward through the crowd of children. "Mother!" The sound shattered something inside everyone standing there. Ayana wrapped both arms around him tightly, while tears streamed down her face, unchecked now. The little boy clung to her, as though letting go might make her disappear again. Cole quietly looked away for a moment, giving them the dignity of privacy inside their reunion. Then another voice spoke from the darkness behind the children. "You should not have come here, Sheriff." Every lantern turned toward the far side of the tunnel. A tall man stepped forward slowly from the shadows wearing an expensive coat stained with mine dust. Cole recognized him immediately. Nathaniel Reed, owner of the largest trading company in Red Hollow. Church donor. Businessman. One of the most respected men in the territory. Sheriff Barrett's expression darkened instantly. It was you. Reed sighed softly, almost disappointed. You do not understand what these mines cost to operate. Walter Grady stared at him in disbelief. Children. Reed spread his hands slowly as though discussing cattle prices instead of human lives. Runaways. Orphans. Apache camps nobody in Washington cares about. I gave them food, shelter, work. Ayanna rose to her feet with Dakota held close beside her. You stole them. Reed looked at her calmly. The territory was built by men willing to make difficult choices. Cole stepped forward before anyone else could speak. No, his voice echoed through the tunnel sharp and steady. The territory was built by people your kind convinced themselves did not matter. Reed's confident expression shifted slightly for the first time. Not fear. Surprise. Because men like Nathaniel Reed expected silence from people like Cole Mercer. They expected comfort to matter more than truth. Sheriff Barrett slowly removed the folded investigation papers from inside his coat. I have enough names here to bury every investor tied to these mines. Reed laughed quietly. And who exactly will believe an Apache woman over men who own half the town? Silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the frightened white boys stepped forward from the group of children. His small hands trembled, but his voice did not. My pa works for Mr. Reed, the boy whispered. He told me not to talk about the tunnels. Another child nodded. Then another. Truth began rising from the darkness, one frightened voice at a time. Cole looked around the tunnel at the children huddled beneath weak lantern light and suddenly realized something important. This mine had not collapsed because of greed. It had survived because too many decent people stayed quiet while children suffered underground. Sheriff Barrett looked at Reed one final time. It ends tonight. And for the first time since entering the mine, Nathaniel Reed finally looked afraid. Morning arrived slowly over the Arizona hills, pale sunlight spilling across wet earth still carrying the scent of rain and cold stone. By dawn, the children had all been brought safely out of the mine, some wrapped in old blankets, some too exhausted to speak, others clinging silently to deputies who could barely meet their eyes from shame. Word spread through Red Hollow faster than wildfire through dry grass. By sunrise, nearly the entire town stood gathered outside the sheriff's office beneath a gray sky heavy with silence. Nathaniel Reed sat alone on the porch steps with mud covering the knees of his expensive trousers, while Sheriff Barrett held the investigation papers in one weathered hand. Nobody defended the mine owner anymore. Not after the children spoke. Not after frightened voices told stories no decent person could ignore. The church pastor arrived before breakfast and removed Reed's name from the donation ledger himself. Without saying a word, men who once shook Reed's hand in public now stared at the dirt whenever he looked their way. But the strangest silence belonged to the townspeople standing near the edges of the crowd. The older ones. The ones who remembered the winter camp that burned 20 years ago. They looked toward Ayanna with something far heavier than fear now. Regret. Ayanna stood near the hitching post beside Dakota while morning wind moved softly through her dark hair. The little boy stayed close against her side, wrapped in one of Cole Mercer's old ranch blankets much too large for his small frame. He had barely let go of his mother's hand since leaving the tunnels. Cole stood nearby watching the town quietly unravel beneath the weight of truths buried too long. He noticed Sheriff Barrett approach Ayanna slowly through the crowd. The old lawman removed his hat before speaking. I should have stopped it sooner. His voice sounded rougher than usual. All of it. Ayanna studied him for several long seconds. Maybe, she answered softly. But you came when it mattered. Barrett lowered his eyes briefly, as though unsure he deserved even that small mercy. Walter Grady stepped onto the sheriff's porch beside Nathaniel Reed and looked out over the crowd. You all spent years calling yourselves civilized, the old rancher said quietly. But it took frightened children trapped underground to remind this town what decency looks like. Nobody answered him. They did not need to. The truth had already settled across Red Hollow heavier than any sermon ever could. Cole turned then and noticed Dakota staring up at him carefully. The boy's dark eyes carried the same quiet strength as his mother's. Slowly, Dakota reached beneath the blanket and held out the silver harmonica. Cole frowned slightly. That belongs to your family now. Dakota shook his head once. My mother says some things are meant to find their way home. Cole looked toward Ayanna. She stood in the morning light watching him with tired eyes softened by something warmer now. Not trust completely, Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Cole took the harmonica carefully in his rough hands. The old silver felt colder than he remembered. I spent 20 years forgetting, he admitted quietly. Ayana stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. And now, she asked. Wind moved gently through the street between them. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang low through the morning air. Cole looked at the people of Red Hollow standing silent around them, then toward the mountains where hidden tunnels still scarred the earth like old sins refusing to disappear. Finally, he looked back at her. Now I remember who saved my life. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ayana reached out slowly and adjusted the collar of the coat he had given her during the storm. Such a small gesture, gentle enough most people would never notice it. But Cole did. My father used to say something, she whispered softly. He said the world only changes when one person chooses kindness after being given every reason not to. Her eyes met his one last time. You finally became the man he hoped that little boy would grow into. Then she turned toward the waiting horses with Takoda beside her, and together they rode slowly out of Red Hollow beneath the pale Arizona sunrise, while Cole Mercer stood in the dusty street, holding an old silver harmonica and wondering how many lives might have changed if somebody had chosen courage 20 years sooner.